Hello and welcome back to Reading Past Midnight. I'm your host, Ron Rutstein. Today we're going to be doing the second episode in the Genocide reading project. We're going to be looking at two books by Slavenka Drakulić, who is a Croatian novelist and reporter. The first is a novel, S, a novel of the Balkans. As you see, I have quite a few notes there. And the second is a work of nonfiction called They Would Never Hurt a Fly. And this is about the war criminals on trial in The Hague. They Would Never Hurt a Fly is a common description used by friends of perpetrators that before the war, these were just normal people and, they wouldn't even hurt a fly. We might talk about someone like that. It's not about justice, because there can be no justice for what took place. It's about some level of accountability, and Drakulić looks past that to Drakulić looks beyond that in order to try and understand what makes people like this, what makes people do this. So we'll talk about that second. When did she realize that there's a future after all? Perhaps the moment she reconciled herself to her own death. It dawned on her that death would be better, and it was then that something inside her snapped. And quite unexpectedly, that moment of complete reconciliation opened her up to the future. S is a woman who is Muslim and is captured by the Bosnian Serbs. She is put in a prison, and within that prison there is a women's room. She is eventually taken to the women's room, and these women are routinely raped and abused. She's repeatedly raped, abused, brutalized by the enemy soldiers who have imprisoned her and the other women. When Yugoslavia broke up, it broke up into a handful of nations, and there became a rise in nationalistic feelings, and tribalism took over. There were Christians and there were Muslims, and each hated the other, and this was now allowed to come out. There were atrocities committed all over what was Yugoslavia. And we probably, people my age certainly remember Slobodan Milosevic and his ilk, who were eventually brought to trial in The Hague. But Drakulić is interested here in the victims. S focuses on the female victims and the mass torture and rape that they endured. And in They Would Never Hurt a Fly, she's more concerned with some of the people below the top who actually perpetrated these and willingly became attackers of their neighbors and friends, people that they had lived with peacefully for decades. All of the characters in S, up until the very end when she is finally freed and taken to live in Sweden, are only told by their initials. The perpetrators are told by their rank sometimes. And this is actually something that when I was reading, they would never hurt a fly. The victims were referred to by their initials. I think this is something that she picked up from that. And this actually had a different title outside of the United States. When we first begin the novel, in the opening chapter, she is pregnant, towards the very end of her pregnancy. Because she was so brutally raped by so many different people, she has absolutely no idea who the father is. And it's too late for her to have an abortion. And she does not want this child because it is just going to remind her of what she lived through. And she feels that she will never be able to get past what she lived through, having this burden. So she already has plans to put the child up for adoption, and the UN workers and the social workers in Sweden are facilitating that. Before the child is born, she goes back into telling the story of what happened before, at the very end of the novel, she returns to that same place and time. So this takes place once they are in the prison. They're there with women and children, and S has been given a piece of salami. She is not hungry at this point. She's not sure. She decides she doesn't want the food. It's very cold. She's very uncomfortable. So she decides to give her salami sandwich, which is 2 slices of bread and 1 piece of salami. She feels sick at the sight of the salami and gives hers to the boy next to her. His mother tells him, "You have to share that with your sister," but it's too late. The salami is already disappearing down the boy's throat. S is shocked by his selfishness. His behavior is beyond her because she has yet to learn what the little boy instinctively knows. This 7-year-old little boy has already learned the first lesson of survival in a camp: selfishness. This brings up an idea that Primo Levi mentions in Life in Auschwitz. He says the best of us died there. The ones that survived are the ones who were willing to become selfish, to make moral compromises, to do whatever was necessary to survive. And here, instinctively, whether it's his hunger or his actual realization that it's the selfishness that's going to help him to survive, she's noticing for the first time that this is maybe a natural reaction to tragedy of this nature. Over the next few days, the detainees assemble in a little wooden hut above the 2 pits, which are latrines. They are finally getting a toilet. It is now more than obvious that they will be staying in the camp, but S is still glad about the toilet. To her, the advent of the toilet looks like major progress in their lives. If they have to live in this camp, at least they will no longer have to defecate out into the field in front of everyone. S can feel herself adapting. Little things which we take advantage of become alien. She does not recognize herself in this camp. Who am I, wonders S, as, one by one, she returns her things, her precious belongings, to the backpack, as she's just gone through everything she has with her. What is the point of these shoes and the dress? Will she ever wear them again? Then she thinks that it is a miracle that the backpack and belongings are still with her, that she has not lost them, that they have not been stolen from her. But something is missing. S rummages nervously through her backpack again, then empties it onto a blanket. She sees that she is missing the little box with her gold jewelry. She feels her lips quiver and is afraid that she will cry, that she will sob like a hurt child. She says she does not recognize herself in this camp. Here, to me, this is clearly showing a beginnings of a loss of identity, a loss of who she was before all this happened, who she was before the war, before she was imprisoned because she's Muslim. She even thinks that it may be best to be done with this senseless attachment to things. What upsets her is the feeling of diminishment, impoverishment, and effacement. She wonders what else she will have to give up and what is the minimum of things with which one can survive without losing the feeling that one is human. This is an interesting statement because it's implying that it's the things we have that make us human. I don't know if that's true or not, but certainly it may not be what makes us human, but it is certainly a part of what creates our identity. Our stuff is part of who we are, what our identity is. Or in the case perhaps of a monk that has nothing, our lack of stuff then becomes defining of who we are. How is it possible to survive all that? S senses that here the survival instinct is the highest law of existence. She is not ready to acquiesce to that, not yet. The words "you can survive anything" reflect a state of awareness that she is still unable to fathom. She hasn't hit rock bottom yet. She still thinks that maybe there's some possibility that maybe they'll trade them for prisoners or something else will happen. The war will go a different way. She hasn't yet been added to the women's room. There's a passage here where running across a bar of soap in order to help bathe. A little bit of, again, what makes us human as the dehumanization process is still going on. The residents of the women's room have to learn that for them, there are no clearly defined borders between day or night. The girls sleep or nap by day. At night, the fear in the room is tangible. The darkness falls as they start listening and trying to discern. They hear from afar the arriving cars or trucks, the voices, then footsteps. They try to guess how many soldiers there are and if they are already drunk. They come almost every night. From nearby combat positions, they say, but who knows whether that is the truth, whether there are any such positions nearby. Sometimes they also come in the daytime, upsetting their fragile routine. One day there's a smell that's permeating the women's room. It's the smell nauseates some of them, makes some of them sick. The smell does not evaporate. They are crowded together like animals, bewildered. S says that the smell reminds her of burned skin when she pressed her leg against the stove as a child. She says this in a whisper, but H suddenly jumps with a start. She raises her head. That's it, she stutters like an inarticulate child. She begins to shake. They wrap a sheet around her, give her water to drink. She gulps it down as if she cannot believe she is still alive. The water spills down her chin and onto her top. Calm down, you're with us, S tells her, stroking her damp hair. Finally, H begins to breathe more evenly. It's true, she says. It's true about the smell. It's the smell of human flesh. The soldiers are burning the corpses of the detainees. At a given point, S becomes the favorite of the captain of the camp. This does provide her with certain privileges, as she only has to take care of one person rather than be subjected to the brutality of multiple and different soldiers on a regular basis. She has consented to this relationship because it makes life in the camp easier. She is exempted from nocturnal visits, and she can sleep and eat better. That is all. She is consciously buying her comfort, bargaining for every minute of time that she spends that way. She admits to herself that she is a coward, but that does not make her feel any better. The captain is never rough with her. Still, she is not sure that that attraction is the right word for what she really feels. The longing for a normal life, for coziness. S sees in him the reflection of that other possible life that someone else must surely be living, and that she wants to live temporarily when she manages to forget where she is. That is something she succeeds in doing, and with each passing day, she shrouds herself more and more in oblivion. For S, oblivion is the key to survival. The only thing I learned in the camp was the importance of forgetting. So, for S, the captain represents a kind of normality, maybe a frightful normality, in that she only has to spend time and have relations with one person. Certainly that's more normal than what she's going through, or that the other women in the women's room are going through. And she's willing to take the advantage of that, accept the few benefits that she gains from this relationship. S gets up early in the morning before the captain sometimes. And there are times when she contemplates killing him, which seems to me a normal thing to be contemplating. But of course, given where she is, there's no way that she would possibly get away with it. This is one morning. S steps out of the room, closing the door softly behind her so as not to wake him. The corridor leading to the women's room is dark. The camp is still asleep. Yet another day is dawning when the captain, undisturbed, will get on with his work as he refers to running the camp. Of course, at the heart of it was the fear that I would have to pay for such an act with my own life. The fear that killing him would at the same time mean my own suicide. I think also in the back of her mind, she would have to know that nothing would change. Someone else would come in and complete the job that the captain is doing, and probably more brutally. We do get glimpses into S's thinking, and that's not something that's mentioned, but I think in that particular situation, there had to be some realization that that would be the case, that she would have to pay for it with her own life. Plus, then someone else would come in, perhaps more brutally, and make things worse for everybody else. Thus, there was really no benefit to killing the captain. A little later on in the book, S finds out exactly what happened to her jewelry. She gets a note from an acquaintance or a friend from the women's room. Dear S, forgive me. I am the one who took your gold jewelry, yours and the other women's. I did it for my little girl. I used it to bribe the soldiers to leave her alone. I hope you understand. Yesterday, I realized that all my efforts to spare her were in vain. I can't go on. E had killed herself after she realized that all those efforts were in vain to try and help her own daughter. The horror of this situation was not something that she could live with anymore. So she took her own life. Eventually, S realizes that she's pregnant. She's starting to swell a little in her belly. Not one of them was unconcerned about whether they would leave the camp with a swelling stomach. They had to think about such things. They had to feel changes in their own bodies. Or were their bodies already so bruised and battered, so much not their own, that they were barely capable of noticing any change? Perhaps they concealed such things from each other and did not talk about it because they were perfectly aware of their own helplessness. There was no way to terminate a pregnancy, yet they could not imagine having a child conceived this way. She remembers the stories of the women in the warehouse. To give birth to a child conceived by rape would be more disgraceful than betrayal for them, a fate worse than death. What if she has lulled herself into a false sense of security? What if her feeling is wrong? A faint bleeding had appeared just once in the women's room, but she was sure that was a consequence of having been raped. She suddenly feels a chill run down her back. Hadn't the girls told her that she had gained a bit of weight? But that was because she was eating well with the captain. She'd know, of course. She would feel it if she were pregnant. S tosses and turns on the floor, and then sits up, gazing into the dark. So slowly but surely, S is realizing that she is pregnant, and she's carrying the child of one of her rapists, one of her attackers. After S is rescued and is allowed to return to the regular world, she finds it strange to be in town after everything that has happened. The main city square offers S a sight that makes it hard for her not to burst out laughing. She feels as if she is looking at a long-forgotten but familiar sight, or as if she has stepped into a Technicolor movie. Trams running, people walking into stores and coming out with their arms full, the store windows all lit up, lovely neon signs saying Vartex, Naprizhid, Nama, Bata, Zagrabacha Banka, high above the flashing Coca-Cola sign. The department store has the latest winter fashions in its windows and a shiny brown fur coat. The tall pine trees are decorated with colorful little lights. The city is already preparing for the holidays. Here, it is as if nothing has happened. That particular city is not far from where the war was taking place. She is originally repatriated with some distant relatives who take her in and allow her to stay with them before she decides to try and completely move away from the area, unable to live with the memory and the reality of what has gone on there. Every woman who comes out of the camp seems to be under suspicion of having been raped, and still they keep silent. Do they think that this conspiracy of silence can conceal their shame, defend their honor? Or is it that their experience is not something one can share with others, not even with those who have gone through the same things themselves? Silence protects us, but it also protects the rapists, thinks S, uncertain whether she herself would be prepared to talk about it. I think one of the most bizarre aspects of this is that society has ingrained in people that a woman that is raped should feel shame. I know this is not nearly as bad as it used to be, but it's still a reality in part of the world. And even when you're as brutally raped as the women in the women's room were, to feel shame for the position you were put in, what to say to that. This is in 1993, January. She is now living in Stockholm, and she has a friend who is a fellow refugee who has taken her in, but who has been there for quite some time and is much more used to the situation and much more normal part. Normal is not the right word. Much more active part of society. G takes her to the Cafe Opera. Crystal chandeliers hanging from the ornate ceiling, white tablecloths, elegant waiters. They sit down by the big windows that look out on to the royal palace. S eats delicate pink salmon. The fish is so beautiful, she's almost sorry to eat it. She is glad that she in no way stands out from the people around them. S knows that she is a foreigner here, perhaps even an intruder in normal life, but at the same time she hopes that nothing bad will happen to her anymore, that is over, that these people here have no intention of hurting her just because she is not one of them. I still want to believe that. At a given point, G is trying to convince S that she should keep the child and raise it herself. Absorbed in thought, G grinds coffee, then she slams the spoon down on the table. I simply meant that in my opinion, the child is not to blame, she explains. S wants to tell her how strange she finds it that G should talk about the child, as if the child already existed and was crying in the next room. How is it that she does not see the person sitting there in front of her and looking at her? Why does she talk about the innocence of the child and not about her own innocence? Is maybe she to blame? What is she to blame for? How to hide from the righteous who are so sure that they know the best thing in such a situation? The worst thing is that they neither listen nor hear. They mean well, but they do not hear. S sees how the kitchen light falls on G's face as she talks about the child. G leans forward in an effort to be convincing. She looms over her like a bird. S eventually gives birth to the child, and the social worker who is handling the adoption is not around at the time this takes place. She is put in a normal maternity situation in Sweden, where they place the mother in a bed and the infant in a bed next to her. So S is subjected to the crying of the baby and the judgment of everyone around her who looks at her because she is unwilling to feed the baby, and she does not speak the language but is desperately trying to explain that the baby is to be put up for adoption and is not supposed to be there with her and is supposed to be in neonatal care somewhere else. Drakulić, in her journalistic writings, was researching the systematized rape of women during the genocides that were taking place in the wars, respective wars for independence in what was the former Yugoslavia. At a given point, she decided, rather than writing nonfiction, that perhaps fiction was the better way to portray this in an affecting manner so that people would read this and be more emotionally affected than they would be perhaps if they're reading a work of nonfiction. Fiction does have the ability to pull you in more than nonfiction does. When you're reading They Would Never Hurt a Fly, you're definitely looking at what she's telling us from the outside perspective. It's like reading a newspaper article. Nonfiction can be presented in a couple of ways. You can do creative nonfiction, which is definitely more effective in pulling you into the situation. But when you're working with a whole bunch of different individuals, different situations, and trying to bring that out. Nonfiction is effective for reporting and for giving factual information. It is not necessarily as good for bringing you as a reader along with her. It can rile up your emotions. It can create anger, jealousy, rage, but it doesn't bring you into the humanity of it the way a novel can, or perhaps the way creative nonfiction can. But creative nonfiction, again, is generally going to focus more on a specific case and carry that from beginning to end. I think she made the right choice in presenting us with S as a novel. And it's profoundly affecting. You can't walk away from it. I mean, you can take the book it down, put it down saying, this is too grim, I'm not going to read it. But if you follow your way through the book, if you read the book, you can't walk away from what this woman went through emotionally. You're going to be pulled in. You're going to feel, to some extent, what she felt. You're going to be horrified more than if you're listening to someone, say, testify in a court. It's more real, even though it's fiction. Art has a way of doing this, and Drakulić understood this and is using art to portray a deeper meaning. And I think she's very successful in this. I highly recommend this book for people who read about genocide, read about the horrors of the world, which is, again, part of what this genocide reading project is about for me, to help expose people to writings of this and to try and get at what humanity is, that we can do these things to each other and go about normal lives before and after. It's kind of frightening, at least to me it is, because you don't know who is going to turn on you as we become more and more aware of the freedoms people are taking now and expressing hatreds. We have to wonder, how far are we away from things like this? And when we see the amount of killings, of violence, of drawing together crowds of people for the purpose of proclaiming violence, if not actually perpetrating violence, we're going backwards. We're not making progress as a species. And there where things are going on, we tend not to want to get involved. That's not our business. Which begs the question, what is our business? At what point do we decide, okay, we're not going to help each other. We're not going to do what is right. These are important questions. They would never hurt a fly. She has one chapter here. Starts on page 18, I'm sure. Very short packed chapter. It's called Justice is Boring. And I think that's kind of why she also chose to write a novel. If you're going to, I'm sure that S sold many more copies than They Would Never Hurt a Fly did. People are just not as interested in what's boring. Drakulić focuses on some of the people that are farther down hierarchy of perpetrators. Yes, there were people up on top in Serbia and in Bosnia who were issuing these orders to exterminate and eliminate Muslims. But they're not the ones that carried it out in general. Sometimes I suppose some of them did, but the ones that carried out these orders were local people. In many cases, they knew the people they were killing. They were neighbors. They were friends. In one of the incidences, one man decides to step up and testify at the Hague because he feels that, okay, things are now settled down and we need to stand up and hold people accountable. And when he comes back home afterwards, he is killed. Some of the people who committed these atrocities were still looked at as national heroes. And Bosnians thought, why are these people being brought to the Hague? We do not recognize the authority of them. We should have, if we're going to hold them responsible, we have to have trials here, which of course would have been joke trials. Hence the need for something like the Hague in situations like this. There is no way, and Drakulić makes very plain, there is no way to come close to even holding 10, 20% of the people who were committing these atrocities. There's no way of bringing them to justice. Chapter 5 is called Boys Just Had Fun. Boys will be boys. This is about 3 Bosnian Serbs who are held accountable. I'm not going to pronounce these correctly. Drakulić Kunarak, Radomir Kovacic, and Zoran Vukovic. One witness describing them says, "These were low-life people who would go around and beg for cigarettes," said one witness about the 3 men from Foka. "But when the war broke out, as soon as they managed to put their hands on some rifles, they began to feel big and strong. They were only brave with us women and children." Perhaps this witness is right. Perhaps low-life men can easily turn into war criminals. Perhaps the presiding judge, Florence Mumba, was also right when she said, "What the sum of evidence manifestly demonstrates is the effect a criminal personality will have in time of war on helpless members of the civilian population." Here she's talking about people who, we would consider lowlifes or nothings. When they're suddenly put into positions of power, particularly power over women and children, or ordered to execute them, will gladly do so. These 3 were not only murderers, they were rapists. They were part of this entire process that was not systematized in the way the Germans did with the Jews. So in one sense, they had a lot more freedom. It was not institutionalized the way it was in Germany, but still the horrors that were in these people were allowed to. The next chapter, "He would never hurt a fly," which is a description used to describe Joran Jelicic. This was a person who was normal. We would call him normal. He was an average guy. He seemed like a sweet kid. He has such a sweet face, Drakulić says in describing him. Their generation grew up healthy. He was born in 1968, which she says makes him the same age as her daughter. He was sentenced to 40 years. I want to touch on 2 things she says at the end, towards the end, in chapter Why We Need Monsters. "Why are you writing about war criminals?" a friend asked me when I told her that I would be going to The Hague for 5 months to follow trials at the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia. I understood her question. She meant, haven't you had enough of all this? Yes, I had. When I finished my last novel, As If I Am Not There, my second book about the war in the Balkans, I was very, very tired of the war. Year after year, for 10 years, I had tried to understand and explain to others the reason for the war, how it came about, and how it unmistakably changed people around me, myself included. I wanted to write about something else for a change, but my thoughts kept coming back to the war. I simply could not put it behind me yet. Confronted with nationalism, my daughter left Croatia in 1991 to live abroad. I lost the country of my birth and of my friends. My world shrank to an almost homogeneous Croatia. Excommunicated from its public life, I spent more and more time abroad until finally I found myself living in Sweden, my second homeland now. Nevertheless, the war would not leave me alone. A few years ago, I gave a reading in Berlin from my novel, As If I Am Not There, which was the European title for S, which was about mass rapes of Muslim women in Bosnia. As usual, after the reading, there was a discussion with the audience. A young man stood up and asked me if I would consider writing a book from the perspective of a perpetrator now. "No, I will not," I answered almost too eagerly, as if doing so would be a crime. True, my books about the war were written from the perspective of victims only. The horror of the war could truly only be described from their position, I thought. The world already knew enough about the perpetrators. How many articles had been written about Slobodan Milosevic? Thousands. In that time, thanks to media, Slobodan Milosevic, Radovan Karadzic, and Ratko Mladic had practically become celebrities. Whatever their crimes had been, it was no longer remembered or even important. If one attempts to write from the point of view of the perpetrators to try to understand such people, how close does it come to justifying their acts? Can we actually understand war criminals? More importantly, why should we even try? These were the questions that went through my mind as I thought about how ominous it was that this subject should be brought up in Germany, of all places. Yet here she is writing about perpetrators, although not in a novel. We have to go to Jonathan Littell for the best example of that, which we will do. You sit in a courtroom watching a defendant day after day, and at first you wonder, as Primo Levi did, if this is a man. No, this is not a man. It is all too easy to answer. But as the days pass, you find the criminals become increasingly human. Soon, you feel you know them intimately. You watch their faces, ugly or pleasant, the way they yawn, take notes, scratch their heads, or clean their nails, and you have to ask yourself, what if this is a man? The more you know them, the more you wonder how they could have committed such crimes. These waiters and taxi drivers, teachers and peasants in front of you. And the more you realize that war criminals might be ordinary people, the more afraid you become. Of course, this is because of the consequences are more serious than if they were monsters. If ordinary people committed war crimes, it meant that any of us could commit them. Now you understand why it is so easy and comfortable to accept that war criminals are monsters, rather than to agree with Erwin Staub that evil that arises out of ordinary thinking and is committed by ordinary people is the norm, not the exception. Many of the people that she writes about in this book were normal people in one way or the other before the war. They held regular jobs. They were friendly. They were family men. They would people you would see and chat with on the side of the road, people you might go to picnics with, and then something snapped. Something allowed them to become what they became. It is indeed a human problem. And we will be looking at shortly in the Genocide series. I'm not sure which one's going to be next, but where is my copy of it? Oh, I took it, so it's over here. The Kindly Ones by Jonathan Littell actually is a novel that is written from the perspective of a perpetrator. Very powerful novel, and very important. Part of Littell's argument is that these are not necessarily monsters that are doing this. Some of them are, but not necessarily all of them. And they are human, just like we are. And they find themselves in this situation that they have, in his case, slowly become more and more a participant in. To some extent, yes, just following orders, but each order takes them a little farther and a little farther. And how do you know when not to? War is horrible. And it can bring out the best and the worst in us. Unfortunately, more often, it seems to be bringing out the worst in us. S, a novel about the Balkans. They Would Never Hurt a Fly. War criminals on trial in The Hague. I'll put links down below. I recommend both of these books strongly to anyone who's interested in this type of reading. Obviously, if you certainly stuck through the video for this long, you are. This is Ron Ruthstein for Reading Past Midnight. Thank you for joining me today. Please remember to like and subscribe to the channel. And once we have 100 subscribers, I will be giving away this copy of Hawthorne's Tales and Sketches from the American Library. Very nice edition. Very good stories. Quite enjoyable.